Well, we're on lesson 43, and we're going to be talking about a Roman centurion. Do you have any idea what a Roman centurion is? Here, I'll give you a little clue. How about one of these? I tried to put it on, but it wouldn't fit me. But anyway, what do you think we're going to be talking about? Yes, we're going to be talking about the military. We're going to be talking about a Roman officer that would be ahead of how many do you think? Think of the word century, 100, over 100 men. That was a Roman centurion. Well, let's talk a little bit about Rome here. You see, we studied Rome all over, but during the Roman time, we were talking about during the time of Jesus. Well, when we think of the Roman Republic, we think of the Republic forming about 500 BC to 27 BC. What happened in the year 27 BC with Rome? Well, we studied about Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar became the emperor of Rome about that time, 27 years before Christ. And the empire went on during, we know, Augustus Caesar, Octavius or Augustus Caesar, into 476 AD. So the Roman Empire now, it's not a republic anymore, it's an empire, lasted about 500 years. And we'll go over that later on in a later chapter, of course. But let's go back to the centurions because they were Romans and they were the backbone of the Roman military. So when you think about the Roman military and you think of the centurion, remember over 100 men, then they would have someone over them. So a centurion, and you would take 10 centurions, over 10 centurions, which were over 100 men, which would mean 1,000 men. So the military officer that would be over 10 centurions or 1,000 men was called a cohort. C-O-R-H-O-R-T, cohort, or C-O-H-O-R-T. I put an extra R in there, but cohort. So they would be pretty important because they would be over 1,000 men. But then there was a guy, the tribune, which was over a legion. So what would be a legion? A legion would be six cohorts. So how many people would that be? How many soldiers would that be? 6,000 soldiers. Wow. So remember, centurion, cohort, and legion. And the tribune command would be over a whole legion. And usually they would be a political leader that would be in command. Well, the greatest ambition of many young boys in Rome would be to be able to be in the military and to be a centurion. They were known for their bravery and their great leadership. Now, the head of the highest rank of course, I said the tribune, but even higher, there was a guy that was above everyone, and they would call him the primus pilus. Primus pilus. Say that word. It was the highest rank among centurions. And this guy, actually, he would be the one that would walk in front because they'd march out in order of who was the highest rank. And so who would come out first would be the primus pilus, the highest ranking centurion among all the centurions. And not necessarily would be a tribune, but he would be the one that everyone would want to follow because he would have the highest rank. So let's talk a little bit more about centurions. Were they very important in Rome? Very much. Because the centurions, to be a centurion, you were pretty well paid. And not only that, well, of course, the primus pilus made the most money of all. But you would be able to invest as a businessman even while you were being a centurion because you'd have the money to do. You'd get bonuses for any victories, especially if the emperor thought, wow, you were really good and you did really good in that battle, he would give you more money. They would have lots of money for retirement. generous retirement. And in fact, a lot of them later on became builders. And the builders that what a lot of centurions liked to build was the baths, because of course the soldiers would all want to come when they came into the city, and they'd all want to take a bath, of course. So they built a lot of these baths. And some went into politics, and some became senators, and some became, I would say, soldiers or guards in the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard was those that guarded the emperor. So it was a very elite position to be guarding the emperor, of course. So what were the centurions' responsibilities? Since they got paid well and they ended up being able to use their money to do all these things, but what were they really doing? Well, we know they had to take orders from above, and they had to be very vigilant and obedient to those orders no matter what. They also had to give orders to their men, and they had to train their men, and they were personally responsible for all of their men. And of course, there was the day-to-day training of their men, that they had to make sure that they were trained for military. And of course, Rome was known for its great military power, as we know. Also, they had to keep their weapons in order. And so he had to make sure that everyone had their weapons and they were in order. What kind of weapons did they have? Well, we know that they would have a sword that they had to keep on the left side and a dagger on their right side. And we'll go over the armor in a little bit, because I want to go over the armor and relate it to the armor that is talked about in the Bible. But anyway, so they had to make sure their weapons, or maybe they had cannons, I don't know, whatever they would have, their chariots, they had to make sure all those things were in order. And they'd have to give duties and responsibilities to their men. And they had to be responsible for their supplies, that all the men would have supplies and be able to eat and be able to have supplies given to them when they needed them, especially if they were going into to an area where they were going to attack somebody. They had to make sure they had enough supplies carried with them. Another thing about a centurion that I thought was quite interesting was that they had to speak Latin, of course, because Latin was the Roman language, but they also should speak Greek. Because, of course, most of the countries that they invade knew how to speak Greek. Remember, the Hellenistic culture went in there, the Greek culture, and so almost everyone could speak a little bit Greek. So centurions should be able to speak Greek and Aramaic too. So there was three languages that a centurion should get to know. So if they were going to be a centurion, they better study before they went to know that they're not only Latin, but Greek and Aramaic, right? Sometimes they would be sent out to hunt for criminals, kind of like a part of a police force. So sometimes they were like police officers. And sometimes they also had a role as a judge. They'd have to stand up and judge in the courts of law. They would call on these centurions, because the centurions were very honorable men usually. And another thing, they had to carry out executions. We find that with the soldiers, even at the foot of the cross in the Bible. Some may have been centurions, or maybe they would just be executioners. And that would be really a horrible job to have, don't you think? So what did they look like? What did the Roman centurion look like? Well, we know they had a tunic, and on their tunic was usually white. It was usually bright colored white. And their cloak, they had a cloak, was usually medium blue. And on their helmet, they'd have insignia. And on their insignia would be what rank they would be on, and any decorations or medals would be on their helmet. So that would be quite interesting to look at these centurions' helmets. Some of the high-ranking servants would have a whip-like staff they would put on their side. And they would have their armor, they would have a shield, and their shield would be very thick leather, or maybe even metal shield. So you would carry a shield. So let me go over some of this armor here. This doesn't really look like, but something like this would be the helmet. And on here it says salvation. You see, in the book of Ephesians, it relates all of the parts of the armor to the Bible. And so it says here, if you can read it, I don't know, it says salvation, that this is the helmet of salvation to protect your mind. Well, a centurion would wear a helmet of salvation to protect his head, and so he wouldn't get a head injury, of course. And then they would have a sword. And what does it say in here? It says, Spirit of the Word of God. Paul related the sword like the spirit of the sword. The sword of God would be the Word of God, the Bible. That we'd be able to use the Word of God just like a sword in fighting the darkness of the enemy. Isn't that cool? Well, they would have a sword. And then they would have something over their heart, of course. And this says, if you can read, righteousness. So Paul would say the breastplate of righteousness covers our heart and protects us from the enemy, from piercing darts in our heart and hurting our heart, because his righteousness, Jesus' righteousness, covers us. How cool is that? And then what do we have? Oh, here's a belt. Of course, they'd have a belt to hold up their armor. And this armor is, this part of the armor, this belt is called truth. It'd be the belt of truth. And you think of the belt of truth holding up that Jesus is the truth and the way and the life. And so him being the truth would be like putting on, Christ would be putting on that belt to hold everything together. How cool is that? And then we have here a shield of faith. The shield of faith. When you walk in faith and step out in faith, those fiery darts come here and there. Boom, 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 boom. And you'll be able to shield yourself from the shield of faith so that the enemy can't get through. How cool is that? And then, of course, they'd have to have special shoes. And the Roman guards, they would have shoes that would be pointed in the bottom so that they would stick in so that they could just grasp the ground wherever they're at. And then, of course, they'd have to have the protections. And they say the gospel of peace, because the Bible talks about the preparation of the gospel of peace in the Bible. Those are our gospel shoes, that we can put our gospel shoes and go anywhere and share the gospel, because it'll take us anywhere. The right shoes, of course, you need the right shoes for the right thing when you're fighting the enemy. So when we think of the enemy in the spiritual sense, of course, the enemy is the principalities and powers of darkness. We don't even fight against flesh and blood. So when we're talking about the spiritual armor, we're talking in a different realm, in the spiritual realm. But in Rome, they had their armor, and a soldier had to wear all of his armor. Another thing about the centurions, they were mentioned a lot in the Bible, and most of the time it was a compliment. Whenever they talked about a centurion, it was a compliment because they were very honorable. In Jesus in Capernaum, a centurion asked Jesus to save the life of his servant. It's a sweet, sweet episode there in Luke 7. And so the centurion was a wealthy man, and he actually had helped the Jews build a synagogue. But he came to Jesus because his servant was sick and dying, and he knew that Jesus could heal. He believed with all of his heart. And so he sent this message to Jesus, and he says, I am not worthy to come to your house, but you just say the word, and my servant will be healed. I say to this one, go, and he goes. To another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does this. And then Jesus said, I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such great faith as this. Not even in Israel. How amazing is that? There were many centurions. In fact, I think there was a centurion at the foot of the cross that said, surely this must be the Son of God. How cool is that? I'm going to read you a little excerpt that I wrote coming about the armor of God. But it's going to have to be in the next video, just a short video because I don't have a lot of time here. But how cool is that we can say we are like centurions in God's army. Isn't that amazing? And bringing forth the gospel to the lost. is a great, great, amazing, and honorable task.